Hidden Tales, the Pirate Queens, and everything in between. We are back with Unique History this week. Hello everyone, I am a mythical dragon, and for today's article exploration for Unique History is Anglo-Saxon conversion. That's probably not a topic most people would think to explore in this podcast-styled series, but what caught my attention was the article title and some of the interesting glimpses of stories, because I've read a lot of fiction, historical fiction from Anglo-Saxon period, and there's some wild things that happened in the Anglo-Saxon time frame that are bewildering, and they believed in a lot of interesting like supernatural elements, shapeshifters, all these kind of cool things that I figured, you know what? This is the talk of them being converted to Christianity, so it is kind of that sort of topic. But I'm interested to hear if there's any more of those fantastical ideas that I've read about for many, many years, since even I was 13 years old. So I'm hoping to find a little bit more of that with this episode today as I go through this article. And I'm back on HistoryExtra.com because the article that I originally was going to do from the magazine, my last one, it wasn't quite unique. I was sort of like, oh, okay. Like, I had that kind of reaction after reading through it, so I figured let's go back to this website for a little while until I can grab another articles and other things from other sources. So, let us begin. The title for this article on History Extra website is Anglo-Saxon Conversion, the Coming of the Cross at the Point of a Sword. I thought that title's very unique and it kind of hints to a lot of drama, so I figured let's do this. This seems like an interesting exploration, so we will begin. Although the Anglo-Saxons' adoption of Christianity has often been labeled as peaceful, in reality many were swayed by the threat of aggression. Mark Morris, the author of this article, investigates the violence that greased the wheels of conversion. So yeah, exactly right. There's a lot of threats here, and I've also read before in other sources that it was supposed to be a peaceful conversion. That's what they believed in. But obviously that wasn't fully the case. So I'm looking forward to reading through this a bit more with you all today and seeing what actually happened with the conversion of Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon period. The story of how the Anglo-Saxons came to be converted to Christianity begins in Rome at some point towards the end of the 6th century. A monk named Gregory, who in 590 became Pope Gregory I, was walking through the market when he noticed some unusual-looking boys being sold as slaves. Struck by their beauty, he asked where they were from and was told they were Angles, prompting a famous pun. From more angles, angels, I get it. Good, he reportedly replied. They have the face of angels, and such men should be the fellow heirs of angels in heaven. Yeah, there you go, angles, angels. Makes sense. I immediately saw it and heard it as soon as I read it. But he thought these boys were beautiful. I mean, the boys are beautiful. Everyone is beautiful. We're all angels. Anyway. Such at least was the tale told by the Venerable Bede. Bede? We'll go with Bede. I like Bede. Venerable Bede, writing around 150 years after these events, who indicated he didn't set very much store in its credibility. Yeah, I mean, 150 years later, it's hard to retell a story word for word, exact for exact, so credibility goes down the drain after that. But like all good legends, it was grounded in reality. 6 years into his pontificate, Gregory dispatched a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons, headed by a monk named Augustine. Arriving in 597, Augustine was greeted by the King of Kent's Ethelbert. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but I'll go with Ethelbert. King Ethelbert, who was extremely hospitable. That's nice. Means he was friendly, welcoming. That's always a good sign. The king soon converted, along with his people, and in the decades that followed, the rulers and peoples of the various other kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England followed suit. By 686, well within a century of Augustine's arrival, all the former pagan politics had become Christian. Alright, that's impressive. That's just under 100 years of work. Pretty interesting. But that's a good overview. But where's the details? Where's the juicy details that we need? Hopefully we get some more here. As you might expect, the process of bringing heathens to the light of heaven is presented to us in our earliest sources as essentially a benign and beneficial one. The heroes of BD's ecclesiastical history of the English people are holy men, such as St. Augustine, or the Northumbrian St. Cuthbert. These words are a little strange, their names are strange. St. Cuthbert. And the good kings like Ethelbert, who listened attentively and facilitated Christianity's spread. Ethelbert, said BD, compelled no one to accept Christianity, and this point was seized upon by later historians as clear evidence that the whole conversion process was voluntary. We nowhere read of any of those persecutions at the point of sword, said the Victorian scholar Edward Freeman, which disgraced the proselytizing zeal of the Frankish and Scandinavian apostles of the faith. Great, so in summary there, because that was a lot of confusing words and a very long sentence, but it looks like the Christianity was so appealing to the English and the Anglo-Saxons that the process was voluntary. Everyone was like, okay, this seems interesting. I'm willing to learn more. Yes, I'll convert. Whereas it looks like other faiths and other apostles from Frankish, I'm trying to remember what part of the world that would be. Frankish. Probably French, yeah, and Scandinavian, so area of Scandinavia, of course, we're not conducting the same conversion in the same way. So they're more forceful, looks like, with the point of a sword, or more threatening with it. At least that's what the Victorian scholar says here. So that was, again, that would be in the 1800s, roughly, where he studied this. So jump a few hundred years later, it's been discovered that this was nonsense. The Anglo-Saxons had been pagan since time immemorial, long before they had started settling in eastern Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries. The fact that 4 of the days of the week in modern English are named after their heathen gods, Woden, Thonor, and Frigg, indicates that their ancient ancestral beliefs were deeply embedded and therefore cannot have been lightly eradicated. Freeman's faith in English exceptionalism apparently blinded him to the occasions where our sources point to exactly the kind of violence he insisted had only happened in other countries, not in dear old England. It would never happen here in our home countries. That seems to be a pretty common attitude when it comes to history, looking at our own history. For example, a lot of Canadians believe that we're really good people. We had a great history. We're very kind and wonderful, but as recently as this year and in many other years and studies and research has shown, not the case. Canadians aren't always the nicest beings on the planet and have done a lot of awful things like, yes, internment camps and segregation, racism. We have the Truth and Reconciliation Act right now that's supposed to try to connect our history and become more accountable to what we've done to the First Nations people of Canada. And it's, when you really, really look at history without any clear objective or bias, it's rough. It's out there. And so I don't blame this guy for his studies and believing England was good and it was peaceful. We did all that we were told. We were excellent people. But again, there's that bias and where he's personally from and what he thinks. And now it's time to look at the actual sources and what actually happened. Because it's usually never how it looks, per se. So, Chased Off by Pagans is the next title here. St. Augustine's mission soon spread from Kent to the neighbouring kingdoms of Essex and East Anglia, and it also reached the far north when King Ethelbert's daughter, Ethelbert, was married to King Edwine of Northumbria, bringing with her a priest, Paulinus, who became the first Bishop of York. But the Roman mission ran into difficulties when the first generation of convert kings died. That's really sad. So first generation, so firstborn, probably the first child or the first male child passed away, so they all died. Oof, that's not a good time. Again, living though in that time period would be difficult, so it's not shocking to hear that, but it is still sad to hear it. The bishops of London and Rochester were chased from their dioceses by new pagan rulers, and both the Queen of Northumbria and the Bishop of York were forced to flee when King Edwine was killed in battle. So a lot of change there, from rule to potential heirs and things that just fell apart for this family, and they are forced out of this north area of England. A lot of change there, and when comes a lot of change comes pretty easy conversion or absolute reconstruction of what was established. So we'll see what happens here next. The pagan rulers kind of took over from this family and established themselves in York and Northumbria and the northern parts of England. In the north, however, Christianity was swiftly re-established by missionaries who hailed from a different direction. Ireland had embraced the new faith in the 5th and 6th centuries, and the new king of Northumbria, Oswald, having grown up in Irish exile, had been converted by Irish monks on the island of Iona. That's a lot in that sentence. Wait a minute. So Oswald was exiled to Ireland. How did he come back to Northumbria and become a ruler, the next king? I want to know more about that story, but maybe that'll be a future Unique History episode, because that is a very interesting story right there. Grew up in Irish exile, been converted by Irish monks into Christianity, and lived on the island of Iona. I want to know more, but another episode. Soon after his accession, Oswald established some of these monks on the island of Lindisfarne, close to his royal seat at Bamburgh. In the generation that followed, missionaries from Lindisfarne not only re-evangelized Northumbria, but they also resumed the conversion of Essex and eventually won over the rulers of the powerful Midland kingdom of Mercia. I've heard a lot about Mercia. That would be a really good episode to look into as well. But anyway. So the two churches, Roman and Irish, were quite different in style. While contemplative Irish monks liked to base themselves on offshore islands, their Roman counterparts preferred their seats to be in ancient cities, abandoned since the days of the Roman Empire. Aesthetic Irish missionaries walked from place to place, whereas Romans ostentatiously rode horses. There were also differences on points of doctrine. Disagreements on how to calculate the date of Easter led to a stormy debate at Whitby in 664, during which the Northumbrian king Oswiu, the brother of Oswald, switched sides, forcing the monks of Lindisfarne to align themselves with Rome. Dang, so a debate over the date of Easter led to an actual battle, a little fight here, and caused the monks in Lindisfarne to convert to the Romanian idea, or Roman version of Christianity instead of the Irish. So there we go, a little bit of conflict there, a little bit of a fight. So again, not very peaceful. Disagreements is never peaceful. And now the next section title here is Seducing Kings. Alright. We've got a lot of history about seducing kings and queens in this website, and now we get to have a little bit more of it in this Anglo-Saxon period. So, seducing kings. But when it came to converting people, the methods of the two churches were essentially the same. The first and most important target for any missionary effort was the king. Here, perhaps the Roman Church had the edge, bringing with them the papacy's association with ancient imperial power and bearing precious gifts. In an effort to induce King Edwin of Northumbria to convert, the Pope sent him a gold-embroidered robe along with a silver mirror and a gilded ivory comb for his queen. Isn't that the truth of life? If you want to bribe someone or persuade someone, you gotta bring a gift or appeal to their senses, and apparently with royalty and kings, gifts and gold and shiny things is the way to do it. Sounds about right for all of history and even in modern day. Yeah. However, Christians of either camp could offer other inducements to aspirational pagan rulers: the power of literacy, enabling them to record laws and grants of land, and the promise of military success against their rivals. Fair enough. So there you go. Gifts, gold, literacy, military. So I guess another way to rephrase that would be money, education, and military. To put it in a modern twist, there is how you can also persuade a country to change sides. That's also been known in history, for sure. We hear more than one king taking what amounted to a spiritual test drive, agreeing to convert if God granted them victory over their enemies. There you go. Kings would be like, you can't give me military promise. All you have is a god. Let's test drive this here. You say your God will help me, your religion, your faith will help me? Well, there's this section of land that I've been trying to take over for years. If I win this with your help and your spirituality, then I will convert fully only after success. If it's not successful, then I'm going to ask you to leave. And who would have thought that would be a way to do it? So again, peaceful, not so much. It led to some conflict, some fighting, and a point of a sword. Maybe not in the actual, convert to Christianity or die way, but a roundabout way of doing it, basically. Most of all, the new religion offered the irresistible guarantee of everlasting life in paradise, an idea that must have had great appeal in a world where the death of rulers by plague, assassination, or dismemberment in battle was a frequent occurrence. Yes. The promise of heaven and the pearly white gates, and that you will find peace after life would be a huge, huge selling point in a time period full of absolute drama and power struggle, for sure. Christianity was equally attractive to other members of the elite. Royal and aristocratic women, for example, embraced the new faith because it offered them an opportunity for self-determination as the heads of monastic communities. There we go. So finally, women were able to have a little ounce of power with the promise of this new faith, this new ideal of living, basically. So they were able to get some power for once, some self-determination in a time period where their only rule was to give birth and make sure they bore a male heir. So they would absolutely eat that up and would be like, oh, perfect, absolutely, I'll sign up and do this. Whitby, the monastery where the famous Synod of 664 took place, had been founded a few years earlier by Hild, a great niece of King Edwin of Northumbria, known to posterity as Saint Hilda. In her capacity as abbess of Whitby, she ruled over both its male and female residents, earning the respect of a whole generation of holy men and women. All who knew her, says Bede, used to call her mother because of her outstanding devotion and grace. There you go. Again, that idea of oh my goodness, I can use my skills as a woman to help a whole area thrive and succeed. I'm going to do that. And with this new faith and this conversion, I believe in it. I'm devoted to it because look at where it's gotten me. It's a great story to tell and a way to help the efforts of conversion further. Now I'm curious about this section here. More stick than carrots. So that idea of you dangle a carrot in front of a stick to get a dog to do tricks or a dog to follow or to like get anyone to follow. So dangling a prize in front of you and you follow along and try to gain it or get it. In this case, more stick than carrot. So more force than reward, it sounds. I think that's kind of the analogy they're trying to go for here. Let's see if I'm right. But what of the non-elite folk? How are they induced to convert? The monasteries founded by kings and aristocrats were not closed-up affairs, and some of their residents took it upon themselves to tour the countryside, preaching and baptizing. But many weeks and maybe months would elapse between these periodic visits, during which ordinary people had no spiritual guidance. They might erect a wooden cross at which to congregate to hear I don't like that word. That doesn't work for me. So, let's try that sentence again. They might erect a wooden cross at which to congregate to hear preachers, and in time it might be replaced with something more impressive like the carved stone crosses that survive from the 7th and 8th centuries. But a system of parishes, with a priest resident in every settlement, lay hundreds of years in the future. Yeah, so this goes for life in general, when you have inconsistencies with someone showing up, or people showing up, or anyone showing up, and they come and go when they please or when they want, you start to lose that trust a little bit. You begin to wonder if this is a real deal, if I should stick with it or not, if I should stick with them. And it increases that gap, that doubt, that mistrust. And so they didn't really set them up for success to convert everyone else that wasn't aristocratic, royal, or in charge of a country, basically, or region. The gulf between the experience of the elite and that of the common folk is well illustrated by a story told by Beatty. He describes how Northumbrian monks were using rafts to move wood along the river Tyne when a storm blew up and swept them out to sea. Their fellow monks wept, Beatty tells us, but the peasants who were watching stood and jeered. Let the monks drown, the crowd declared, for they have robbed people of their old ways of worship, and how the new worship is to be conducted, nobody knows. There you go. They introduced this new idea of worship, got them to convert, promised that they would help them and teach them how and how it works, but never showed up enough to do so, and then this catastrophe happened. And they celebrated because they didn't believe in them. They didn't believe it would work, because if it were to work, they would show up, they would show us, and we would be on our own and independent and able to thrive under this new form of worship, and we weren't able to. There you go. There's that gap. And that can be said for anything too. With education, if you've got a teacher who isn't consistent with supporting the class or being able to deliver lessons effectively, regularly, and consistently, there will be gaps of knowledge, there will be gaps of support, there will be gaps of learning, and then the students don't succeed. Or people won't succeed either when you have that gap, or that lack of care, motivation, and persuasion too. This incident suggests that when it came to the conversion of ordinary people, there was probably rather more stick than carrot. So there you go, there's that phrase there, more stick than carrot. So there's an attempt, but no reward. I am not going to be able to say this king's name, so King Erisambert, I'm going to say that. I'll make sure to put the article down below for you guys. And yes, there's a dog barking outside. I'm sorry. Downtown's a noisy area to live. I'm going to say that in every episode, I think. My apologies, everyone. But King Erisambert of Kent, who ruled from 640 to 664, was praised by Beatty for being the first Anglo-Saxon king to order the destruction of pagan shrines across his whole kingdom and for forcing people to fast during Lent. Wow, there we go. So Bede actually praised this king for finally getting rid of the reminders of the previous worship of paganism by destroying it all, and now actually having people fast during Lent in this new worship, this new form of religion and faith. Interesting to praise a guy to do that, but at that time period, if you believed in it, you were happy with it, and you got it, so there you go. A whole generation later, Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury, newly arrived from Rome, but originally from Cilicia, now Turkey, it's the country Turkey, banned all manner of heathen customs. People burning grain to purify a house in which a corpse was resting, or mothers who placed their daughters in ovens to cure them of a fever. Okay, say what you will about forcing people to give up their customs and their religions and their beliefs and their worship, but in my opinion, it might be okay to get rid of a couple of those things. It sounds awful. But also, I don't know, it's hard to debate this because that's what they believed in, they thought it would help, and it did help, and they had proof it helped. So they had that tradition, and it was good for them, it worked for them, so you can't really hate them for doing it, but also like, oof, interesting things to do to help cure someone of a fever, for example. Such prescriptions and the persistence of pagan worship, in spite of them, invite us to consider the nature of the earliest conversions. In a letter from 598, Gregory I boasted that Augustine had baptized more than 10,000 people in Kent on the first Christmas after his arrival. Similarly, Bede relates that Paulinus, the first bishop of York, spent 5 weeks at the royal estate of Yevering in Northumbria, baptizing every day from dawn till dusk. In both cases, Bede claims these mass conversions occurred because people flocked to embrace the true faith. But did they really flock, or were they herded? I had the exact same question in my mind, not worded that way, but I was wondering, did they really run over to be like, oh yes, please convert me and baptize me? Or was it more of like, you better go now or else you have nothing else left kind of thing? I wonder. Now, having assured us that it was said Ethelbert of Kent compelled no one to accept Christianity, Bede adds that the king nevertheless showed a greater affection for believers, since they were his fellow citizens in the kingdom of heaven. With warrior kings like Ethelbert, it was always wise to remain on their affectionate side. Yeah. You've got a king who's very military focused or conflict focused. If he saw you less than who he was or who his believers are, that would frighten you, because who knows what could happen to you. Maybe they'll hunt you down and kill you, or force you out and take your lands. There's so many different things that could happen if you are not a true believer or loyal to the king. There's many, many cases of that, so I'm not surprised to hear this here. Oof. The belief that the rapid conversion of vast numbers of people... Oh, my words are stumbling today a little bit. The belief that the rapid conversion of vast numbers of people can only have been achieved through royal compulsion is born out of the biography of Saint Wilfrid, who was at various times Bishop of Northumbria and the de facto Bishop of Mercia and Sussex. Busy guy, covered a lot of area in England there. During his time in Sussex, boasts his biographer, Wilfrid baptized thousands of pagans in a single day, some freely and some at the king's command. There you go. Yep, sounds about right for history. Make the kings forcing people to do what they need to do and what they should be doing. Other episodes in Wilfrid's career demonstrate that both he content to see Christianity spread through more overt forms of violence. Okay, yeah. He was happy to actually force people into this new faith, this new religion, this new worship. And to do so, he would use violence. So there's a bit of an agreement in this biography and his stories that violence was actually used. For instance, on the occasion of the dedication of his splendid new church at Ripon, the bishop delivered a speech before King Egbert of King Egbert of Northumbria and all his courtiers, in which he listed all the lands that had been donated by the king and his predecessors. Interesting. So he constructed this new church at Ripon and believed that all of these people that were converted and worshipped this new faith willingly donated this land to the king and his people because they believed in Christianity and were loyal to him. Alright then. Egbert had won these lands as a result of his recent war of conquest against the British rulers to his west, and Wilfrid had been given the estates deserted by the British clergy, fleeing from our own hostile sword. Never say sword. What is wrong with my words today? Well, there you go. So there's a battle, there's a conflict. They won over these lands here in the west of Northumbria, Sussex, and these areas. They won these lands through conflict, through fighting, and Wilfrid, as the Archbishop, took over these lands because the others that were there and were practicing clergy before had to flee due to the conflict, the fighting, and there was nothing else that could be done. Yeah. So, the threat of violence was there, I think, for this conversion period here. Ooh, next section here, now that I scroll down a little bit, is titled Merciless Slaughter. It's the Merciless Slaughter. Oh boy, and that's how we end this here in this article with this last story. Oof. What a way to end it. We got the sense of like being forced to convert from the kings of England and the lands, that you are not loyal to me unless you do convert, and having that threat there to actually obtaining new land and new growth as a kingdom, and having everyone there either flee or be converted. There's that threat of violence, that threat there as well. And now we're actually getting to the violence here, the actual violent points of this conversion by looking through the story entitled Merciless Slaughter. When it came to the conversion of the Isle of Wight, however, even Wilfrid's biographer sought to minimize the bishop's involvement. So shocking was the violence that unfolded. The biographer's like, now, not to make Wilfrid a bad guy, we'll just say that he was not there, had nothing to do with this, but this is what happened. So tried to dismiss him a little bit, when actually he probably was behind it all after all. Oh boy, that sounds about right. During Wilfrid's time in Sussex, the kingdom was invaded by a pagan warlord called Cadwalla, who killed the sitting South Saxon king and then went on to depose the king of Wessex. By the mid-680s, he was poised to conquer the Isle of Wight, which at the time was an independent kingdom. Cadwalla, says Beatty, endeavored to wipe out all the natives with merciless slaughter and to replace them with inhabitants from his own kingdom. This genocidal scheme, carried out by a heathen king, was nevertheless supported by Wilfrid, for the inhabitants of Wight had not yet been converted, and the bishop saw conquest as a way of bringing them to the light. That is so harsh. Yes, let's support this pagan king, someone who I don't personally believe in his genocidal attempt to get rid of all these people in this isle. And then, because I supported him and his rule and his conquest and of all the murder, I can use that as my advantage to persuade them to convert. What a time period we live in, everyone. I did not live in this time period, but what a time period that was experienced, I should say. Oof. That's one way to get support, I suppose. And this last little sentence of this paragraph confirms what I just said. In return for lending his spiritual support, Wilfrid was given a quarter of the island as a reward, a massive endowment of land that meant Christianity was established on the strongest of footings. There you go. My goodness. So tricky and so manipulative, but it worked and it was effective, I suppose. So congratulations, but I don't recommend living your life in the way that the Anglo-Saxons have lived their life. No. Let's talk it out, have a conversation, minimize the threats, be honest with your feelings. Oof. Anyway, getting distracted here. There's a little bit more here with the violence, and I glanced at a couple sentences and oi, okay, here we go. The King of Whites, Arwald, seems to have perished during the fighting, but his two younger brothers managed to escape to the mainland, where they hoped to remain hidden. Soon, though, they were betrayed and handed over to Cadwalla, who ordered their execution. The only consolation Beatty was able to draw was that both boys were permitted to receive baptism before they were killed, and so made sure of their entry into the eternal kingdom. So again, threat of violence, last desperate moments of trying to remain on to some hope for after death. They were converted so that they could feel that sense of peace at the end. Despite being executed and murdered and killed, there's a sense of peace in knowing that there is something to go to after death. And so they use that as a selling point for conversion in Christianity, despite it still meaning death for both boys. Wild. This is wild. History is wild. That's a nice little wrap up and bow by looking at our past. It is wild. But, as B noted, the Isle of Wight was the last of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to convert. By the late 680s, according to his reckoning, Britain had no more heathen rulers. Sure, Beatty. Half a century later, when Beatty was writing his famous ecclesiastical history, Christianity had advanced a great deal further, and he was able to conclude by listing all the many bishops who were ministering to the various kingdoms and celebrate the continued increase in the number of monks and nuns. Oh, craziness. I don't know if I would like this Beatty guy or not. He seems quite biased in his writing, but I kind of want to look at this ecclesiastical history because it could be interesting to actually read his perspective instead of having it as a third-party article like we are having it today. Oy. It was thanks to the assiduousness of these individuals that thousands of others must have eventually been brought to a fuller understanding of the new faith. Men and women such as Augustine, Cuthbert, and Hilda, through their tireless efforts and exemplary devotion, had gently and patiently won hearts and minds in a way that led future generations to remember them as saints. Scholars like Beatty or Hadrian, the abbots of Canterbury who came from North Africa, ensured the history of the conversion was not forgotten and that the learned languages of Latin and Greek were taught as widely as possible. But we deceive ourselves, as Edward Freeman did, if we pretend that the rapid advance of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons, particularly in its early days, was accomplished only by these peaceful methods and did not involve persecutions at the points of the sword. For many, their initial conversion was brought about through compulsion, violence, and bloodshed. There you go. That is the article there. It's, yeah. I think a lot of people, a lot of historians, or a lot of people with some bias to them would want to preserve the idea of peace and conversion and keep using that as a data point, as a selling point, that they're good people and that's all they want to do is bring you into what makes them good people. But it also does ignore the violence, and I think articles like this are very important to have and to read and to learn and to discuss, because a lot of time in our own personal histories, where we're from, where we live, we only get presented that story, that peaceful story, the bare minimum mentions of violence, when reality is, no, there's much more involved to this. And we need to have these revealed. We need to explore these. We need to learn from it. We need to talk about it, because to ignore it or to diminish it doesn't actually fully accept or confirm our stories. So that's that last stance I have on that. But that was the conversion period. So a lot of crazy tales here. A lot of interesting pagan beliefs too were shared there. And the way that they converted and started to use a lot of threats and persuasion and violence and war and all these things to obtain new land, more rule, more control. Through all of these things is how Christianity was really brought into England and that area of the world in the 600s. Wild, crazy, and I appreciate the honesty and the actual digging to find this out, because we need to reopen our history, relearn what we've learned, and accept it, apologize for it too, and begin to heal and move on. For a story like this though, because it was hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it's difficult to do that healing and that apologizing per se, but it's still good to have that honesty come through and come out. And that's the most important part of history, is to have an honest, hopefully unobjective perspective of it. It's not going to be fully unobjective or unbiased, because there's bias in everything we do. But to reveal it in a way such as this article had, we need more of that, basically, is where I'll end my soapbox here in rant. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope this was interesting to you at all. And again, I'm very bad at pronouncing names, so I will make sure to put the article in the description below so you can see why I struggled with names like Egberts and Lisfaren and all these interesting names. I've been trying to learn a little bit more of the Anglo-Saxon English to better pronounce these things, but I'm not perfect. No one is. So take a look for yourselves, and hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll see you in the next video and the next unique history chapter. That's another book closed. Farewell, and thank you for listening.